Hello there. So today I wanted to talk about the case for the Kickstarter 2 and to compare it to the case for the Kickstarter 1. Now, this is a Kickstarter 1 case. You'll see the lighting is having a field day with this recessed area here where the keyboard goes. This is not classed as an A surface, it's something that's buried underneath the keyboard, so we don't really care how pretty this section looks. But as you know, anyone who owns a Spectrum Next will know that the Sinclair logo is polished. Rest of this top A surface is textured, and we also have on the upper case we have the polished upper, we have a textured lower, although the lower does move into polish around where the Joy lettering is. And then of course the rear is textured, and this section here is polished. Okay, so that is a Kickstarter 1 case. I'm just going to show you the latest Kickstarter 2 case. Get out of this bag. There we go. Now, of course, the case here looks lighter because of the position on the table and the way the light is hitting it. If I was to bring in the Kickstarter 1, you can see there that it lights up in the same way, so it's basically the same. Although the first major difference you'll spot is that the keyboard recess is now textured. Don't actually know why that was done. It was done. I think it looks nicer. Looks more consistent with the rest of the uppercase. But you do it or you don't do it. It doesn't make any difference to the eventual product. So that's the first difference. If you want to spot Kickstarter 2 from Kickstarter 1, on the uppercase this will be textured. Now the next thing is more subtle. The texture on the Kickstarter 1 is slightly more defined, so the texture on the Kickstarter 2 is slightly more subtle, and you'll only really know that when you have, say, two side by side and you have a look and you kind of hit the light just right, and you'll see that the texture is slightly more pronounced on the Kickstarter 1 than it is on the Kickstarter 2. Next thing is something I can't demonstrate. These are screwed together and I have no coloured plugs in the Kickstarter 2 unit. Historically, these coloured plugs were mated to the case via a heat staking process. That is effectively melting the pins on these to bond with the case, and I believe they used maybe a soldering iron or something to do that on the original. Very manual, labour intensive. And on the Kickstarter 2 we have a jig that does that, and it makes nice kind of mushroom head bits on the end of the pins. Looks more aesthetically pleasing, but some would say that, well, it's inside, why does it matter? It just looks nicer, and that's another way you can differentiate the Kickstarter 2 case from the Kickstarter 1 case. Next up is the light pipe. So the light pipe on the Kickstarter 1 is a specific length. I can't remember the length now. And on the Kickstarter 2, which doesn't have the light pipe in this sample, the light pipe is now longer and is a tighter fit. Okay, so that's light pipe. In the Kickstarter 1, if you didn't have a Raspberry Pi, you would have a Raspberry Pi blanking plate. This Kickstarter 1 case doesn't have. I think the blanking plate's actually rattling around inside the case. Problem with the blanking plate is that there was a conflict on the blanking plate, which meant that it couldn't take two screws and fit correctly. So we only typically screwed it down in one position. But on the Kickstarter 2, the shape of the Raspberry Pi blanking plate has been changed, and a section of that blanking plate has been cut out so it fits better and can be screwed in both positions. So that's that. And I can't demonstrate that here because I don't have the new Raspberry Pi blanking plate for this Kickstarter 2 case. Flip out feet. Okay, so there have been people who have damaged their feet, and I guess if any significant pressure is placed on the Next when the feet are deployed, you're going to potentially run the risk of breaking those feet. So the feet haven't been redesigned for Kickstarter 2, but they have been strengthened. And what we do now is we have ABS and PC, kind of a combination of those two elements, which results in a stronger plastic. Next thing is the expansion port. So the expansion port blanking plate on the Kickstarter 1 unit was incredibly tight, and you needed like a screwdriver or something sometimes to prise it out. The reason for that is because the part was changed unbeknownst to us, and the I-beam that connects into the slot of the board was increased in size. It made it incredibly difficult to remove. So now on the Kickstarter 2 units, the edge connector blanking plate is now correct and is a lot easier to remove and insert. That's that. The next thing is a cosmetic thing, and I'm probably not going to be able to demonstrate it very well here, but when you look at ports on the Kickstarter 1 units, I'm trying to try and highlight this, where you can see DC 9 volts there, you'll see a diagonal line emanating from the hole in the port. Similarly, you will see similar things, if I can get the lighting right, between the ear mic and audio out, and also if I looked at keyboard and mouse, you can see there's kind of a line there, and there's also an artifact that looks like a fingerprint. And generally the rear of the unit did have kind of scratches and defects, and a lot of people did highlight that. These are knit lines. That's where the plastic is injected. It kind of flows. You've got two channels of plastic effectively flowing around this, and they meet, but they don't necessarily bond together perfectly. So what you'll find in the Kickstarter 2 case is the situation is improved. So let me just get around that way around. Just trying to get light. Actually, yeah. So knit lines are kind of difficult to eliminate entirely because it's just the nature of plastic injection, but I can hand on heart say that the situation has improved and the polish is better. There is less. I know what I'm trying to do here is to get the light on it in such a way that it kind of makes it look horrible. But the knit lines and such and the defects, when you're looking at it, just, you know, with the naked eye and not having a strong light, you know, highlighting it, the Kickstarter 2 is a lot more polished, a lot cleaner on the rear than the Kickstarter 1. So that's nice. That's a nice improvement. Next thing is the screws, and obviously I don't have any screws in this one. Do I? No screws in that one. In the Kickstarter 1 we used silver screws, and in the Kickstarter 2 we are using black screws. And of course I don't have any feet in this one. This is just a sample. Yeah, so black screws I think give it that extra kind of air of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. What's his name? I'm talking rubbish. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, the next change is with the threaded inserts, and the threaded inserts are what screws the upper and lower case together. We can see here in this Kickstarter 1 sample we have threaded inserts at these points here. We are missing one here, but this is just a prototype, you know. It actually ended up being the finished case, but obviously there's no insert in this one here. And the way this was done with Kickstarter 1 is that the 5mm, I think they were, in terms of depth, the inserts, they're put on the end of a soldering iron, so it's a very manual process. The insert is then heated up to a certain temperature, and then using the heat it melts the plastic, the insert is pushed into the screw boss. And it obviously gives far more mechanical strength than just pushing it in cold and dry. But there are issues with doing it that way, and foremost is that you're not necessarily going to get perpendicular insertion. So it has to be exactly 90 degrees, you know, in the vertical. Otherwise, it's going to reduce the ability for that to hold and for the screw to be inserted perpendicular. So in the Kickstarter 2, there is a jig, which I can't demonstrate here. The inserts are longer in the Kickstarter 2, and they are inserted by a jig which effectively heats up all 6 threaded inserts at the same time, pushes them in perpendicular, exact every single time. So that will prevent any issues around screws being inserted too tightly, hopefully, and you know, should a threaded insert fail and just spin freely within the boss, that's obviously a problem that we don't want people to have, so this would reduce that as well. Just looking at other things, what else have we got? Not sure if the text is slightly different. I think there's slight differences in alignment of text. Let's just have a look at that now. Try and get that there. Right. Kickstarter 1 on top, of course, it has the buttons. Kickstarter 2. You know, so that's only, it's not an improvement, it's just the fact that some of the text is in a slightly different position. The reset text is slightly further away from the hole on the Kickstarter 2. Fairly similar Kickstarter 1, Kickstarter 2 for the text on the rear. So yeah, the idea was, and just to go into a bit of case history here, we've never had a situation where we have had time to do the case in such a way that, well, in a way that it would normally be done. Now, rewinding back to Kickstarter 1, and when we had the initial factory manufacturer doing the case, and all of the meetings that were had at SMS, where you had Rick Dickinson, Phil Candy, plastics manufacturer, SMS, and they were effectively discussing the design. They were feeding back any kinds of issues or concerns with the design. The moulders were going away and they were kind of working out how they would do this, how it would work, how the plastic would flow into the mould and such. So they'd kind of feed back their observations and they'd decide on, okay, we'll have an injection point here and all that kind of stuff. Because what happened with Kickstarter 1 is that our plastics company pulled out at the last minute. We were scrabbling around to find someone else, and we didn't have the time to go through that whole process at the start. What we effectively had to do was say, here's a design, make it. And it took a very long time. The second time around, we had another issue. The plastics company who had delivered the Kickstarter 1 cases told us all of a sudden, when we were ready to press the big button, you know, go button, they told us that the moulds were no longer viable, which is a situation that had changed since a few months earlier when we'd asked them to confirm and everything was good. And we made that difficult decision. Do we go with the first company again on the understanding that we'd spent a lot of time going from A to Z effectively, A being the very start of case production and Z being, the finished product, and this 18 months. And it was felt by myself and Enrique that it would be potentially painful, and Phil as well, our industrial designer, who was there every step of the way. And we'd had really good results from our new manufacturing partner on other fronts. So they're doing the boards and the boxes, the packaging, manuals, they've sourced the SD cards and power supplies and everything. They do everything apart from the case and the keyboard. And we'd seen examples of their work in the plastic injection space, and we were suitably impressed with that. So we made the decision to shift production away. So again, you're kind of having to hit the ground running. You don't have a lot of time up front because we're in kind of flow. We have confirmation that FPGAs are available, for example. That unblocks us on the number of fronts we can go ahead and start manufacturing. So we don't have a lot of time up front. You're basically just running the whole way, saying, here's the design, make it work as best as you can. And 5 or 6 iterations later, this is what we have in the Kickstarter 2 space. It's happened a lot more quickly than it did for the Kickstarter 1, which is a very positive thing. I'm very pleased with this case as it is now. I've seen kind of the previous examples of where defects arise. I've seen firsthand what happens when you look at a particular defect and say, okay, we'll try and address that defect, and you then balloon or inflate something else on the board, in the case. So you probably remember the pain that we suffered with the bending, the built-in stresses that we could never seem to get right in the Kickstarter 1 unit. This Kickstarter 1 unit here isn't actually screwed together, but certainly in this area here you can see where the built-in stresses effectively are causing the plastic, it's causing the thing to bend, and you can see it on the other side as well. And we rely on the mechanical force of the screws to bring it more into alignment. You also had those areas designed around bringing the case into accordance by virtue of these sections here, which you have these screw bosses fitting into these holes and forcing it into more perpendicular. Those are still present on the Kickstarter 2 because we tried them with and tried them without, and it didn't actually make any difference. So yeah, the board as well being inside the case does help bring the case into more of an alignment. But the Kickstarter 2 case is pretty damn good. I mean, this doesn't have a board inside it, but it's pretty damn straight. This lower case section isn't in the same plastic, by the way, as the upper case section. We started off with a particular plastic and then kind of decided it wasn't dark enough and then went darker. But the lower case section is still using the old type. So as I say, this is still a prototype, but it kind of demonstrates where we are with the case. I think we're in a good place. And then once the correct plastic is used for the lower case, it will blend better in terms of colour because it looks quite grey compared to the upper case, even though the upper is polished and the lower is textured, so you will see a bit of a difference there anyway due to the way the light's going to hit it. So that in a nutshell is a discussion around the Kickstarter 1 and the Kickstarter 2 cases and the difference between the two. There you go.